Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Grattan Institute webinar on schools and equity. I'm Kat Clay, the Head of Digital Communications at Grattan, and we're an independent, non-politically aligned think tank based in Melbourne, but with policy recommendations for the whole of Australia. Today, we're discussing the impact of COVID lockdowns on schools, and I'm sure there are many parents and teachers in the audience today who are looking forward for some students going back to school in Victoria. Today, we're talking especially about students who experience social disadvantage and how we can help those students get back on track. Although many other states are experiencing relative freedoms at the moment, COVID will be with us for quite some time, and the impacts of school closures and disruptions will be felt by students and educators long after schools open back up. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, wherever you may be in Australia or even abroad. I'm lucky to be along the Maribyrnong River in the lands of the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and any Aboriginal people here today. Thank you all very much for coming. We've got a really great panel here today with three experts in this field. So Robbie Coleman is dialing in from overseas, and he's the head of policy at the Education Endowment Foundation, EEF, an independent organisation in the UK that examines the evidence on what works in schools. Robbie is the co-author of a report estimating the impact of school closures from coronavirus and is part of the team setting up the recent national tutoring program as part of a COVID catch-up strategy. Jennifer Buckingham is the founder and director of 5 from 5 Reading Project, a director at Multilit, and a board member of AITSL and the Centre for Independent Studies. Julie Sonneman is the Acting Director of School Education at Grattan Institute. Julie is an economist by training with experience in government policy and system design in school education, and was the author of a recent report on COVID and catch-up for disadvantaged students, which we'll be talking a little bit about today. In relation to this report, I'd really like to thank the Origin Energy Foundation for their generous and timely philanthropic support, which made our work in this space very possible. So today the plan is to have a panel discussion for about 30 minutes, followed by about 20 minutes of questions from the audience. And we've already got some great questions from you through the registration process. So we'll be talking about that a bit later today. We've also got a question and answer box where you can submit questions. So please feel free to share your questions in there. We can't get to every single question today, but we will try our best. So let's start with you, Julie. I'd really love to hear a little bit more about the report that you released on COVID catch-up. Can you tell us a little bit about the key findings from this report on the likely impact of remote schooling on disadvantaged students? How big are those learning losses?
Thanks, Kat, and it's great to be here this afternoon. So the learning losses from COVID don't fall evenly across the student population. So our work really built on a literature review that was done by the Education Endowment Foundation, where Robbie is from. And basically what it finds is that the learning gap between advantaged and disadvantaged students increases at about 3 times the regular rate when children are not at school. So basically, it really reaffirms that school is a really important equaliser in society. When remote schooling is done really well, it can definitely help stem some of those learning losses. And there's no doubt been a lot of variation across schools in how well teachers and students have done during remote learning. But we do know that students from socially disadvantaged backgrounds tend to find remote learning harder for a number of reasons. It can be because they may have less parental support in the home. They may have less access to digital devices. They may not have as quiet a places to study. They're also more likely to already be behind in their learning before remote schooling. And so just the simple act of having to work more independently can be a lot harder if you're already behind in your learning, or if you have a learning difficulty, which makes those sort of existing challenges even harder. We also know that there are students from a background other than English. Their parents may not have been able to help them during remote schooling, for example. If all the instructions are coming through in a different language, then obviously you're now relying on a parent who can't necessarily help as well. So we are suggesting that in terms of a catch-up response, targeted support is really needed because of this really wide variation in experience, and really targeted at students from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. We do know that this is really compounding an existing equity problem. So there are learning losses, particularly in a state like Victoria, which has been in remote schooling for 2 terms, almost half the school year now. But what we know is that the existing equity gap is really large. So yes, the losses are a worry, but if you look at a typical year, a year 9 student from an advantaged background is likely to be 2.5 years ahead of a student from a disadvantaged background. So really what we're seeing here is there's a need to really address and get on top of these concerns that are now just a lot bigger than what they already are.
And it seems to me that the COVID situation has really highlighted that division as well in terms of learning between advantaged and disadvantaged students. What do you recommend that governments do to help close this equity gap once school returns, especially in Victoria?
So our report looked at, did a scan of the interventions around what works to catch up in a short period of time. So, what are the things that are ready to go and can be operationalised in schools pretty quickly that teachers are comfortable with and are shown to work at scale? And where is there evidence of impact? So where has this been rigorously evaluated before? And one of the other criteria is we know that governments are also spending quite a lot of money at the moment on the economy. So are there any ways in which that kind of spending could be channeled towards schools if possible? And what our scan revealed was that there are 2 interventions that really jumped out. One is tutoring, so small group tuition or one-on-one tutoring. And also literacy and numeracy programs, which are shown to be effective. So where there's like a really specific way of teaching reading or maths, for example, at a particular year level, and where there's been tried and tested pedagogies and those particular materials are sort of packaged up, and it's something that teachers can be trained in and roll out within 6 to 12 months. So there's a number of really sort of discrete areas like that could be expanded. Obviously not, those 2 initiatives are shown to work. That doesn't always mean that will be the right thing for every child who might be struggling. So we're also recommending that there be investments in teacher training on assessment as a first step. So teachers, always are looking at where a student at in their learning, but it's a really difficult thing to do well. And given the circumstances, it's a really opportune time to support teachers with training and access to some good tools so that they can then match students with the intervention that's likely to help them the most. And obviously the last thing that's really important, by no means should be last on the list, is around student wellbeing. So students obviously, particularly in Victoria, are coming off the back of pretty long socially isolated periods. So having time to readjust is going to be important, and just giving teachers a boost in training in terms of being able to identify students who might be having mental health issues so that they can refer them on, and also giving teachers a bit of guidance around how do you help kids readjust. So what are the good ways to teach explicitly social and emotional skills after the experience that we've just had? So that's also another important area.
Thanks, Julie. And you certainly raise an important point about the mental health welfare of students as well. And if you haven't read that report yet, but like to check it out, it's actually available for free on our website at grattan.edu.au. If you go to the publications tab on our website, you should be able to find it there. Now, Jen, I'd like to turn to you now. You've done research in literacy that highlights that many Australian students fall behind in reading in a regular school year, even without COVID lockdowns. Can you give us a sense of the scale of how many children fall behind at school and why children with social disadvantage tend to fall behind more than others?
Yes, Kat, well, we started working on a publication looking at the numbers of children who complete primary school and move on to secondary school without being able to read proficiently. And that's something that I started working on last year as part of the 5 from 5 project with Learning Difficulties Australia and Ausfeld. Both organisations have a long history of working in that space with children and with adults actually with difficulty with reading. So when we looked at those numbers, we discovered that it was pretty shocking. About 50,000 children started Year 7 in 2019, so the last NAPLAN results that are available, not being able to read very well, if at all. So that's at either at or below the national minimum standard. And we know that national minimum standard is a very low standard. We're not talking about a proficient standard, just a very basic standard of reading, and 50,000 students. So those students just didn't sort of suddenly stop being able to read well overnight. They were identified, or most of them were identified in Year 5 and in Year 3. So 2 years and 4 years before that. And obviously, since they're still showing up in those stats as not being able to read very well, their reading difficulties had not been addressed or had not been addressed effectively, one or the other. And in fact, the numbers grew from Year 3 up to Year 7. So we saw evidence of that well-known effect called the Matthew effect, where students, if they're struggling in the early years of school, they're highly likely not to catch up. And Year 3 is a bit of a pinch point for that. Those numbers, or the large proportion of those students would be students from disadvantaged backgrounds. They'd be overrepresented in those numbers, and that is for the sorts of reasons that Julie just talked about. So they start school behind their peers in terms of oral language, in terms of knowing what it means to be literate, understanding the alphabet. Their language difficulties, if they have them, may have been less likely to be have been picked up. There are lots of reasons that those students start school at a greater risk of not being able to read well, and that risk becomes even greater over time, unfortunately, instead of lesser. And there is, as Julie said, some equalising effect from schooling, and they're certainly better off than they would be without school. But we know that from research that highly effective instruction and intervention can close that gap considerably more than it has been.
I think that leads quite nicely into the next question I was going to ask you, which is, what do schools and teachers need to do differently to avoid disadvantaged students and other students from falling behind?
Well, the Primary Reading Pledge is the report that I was talking about, and it looks at a response to intervention model. So there are many schools that are doing this and doing this really well. So I don't like to generalise and say that no school is providing this exemplary approach to instruction. I can name some that aren't, that are, but many aren't, and it's largely because the teachers have not learned about this in their initial teacher education. There hasn't been professional learning around it. And also it needs to be resourced. So providing intervention for struggling students is relatively resource intensive. But this particular initiative or framework that we put together, it starts with the premise that, we hope all schools are starting to work towards a very high quality level of classroom instruction. So that's called Tier 1, and that's being addressed through other objectives. But what we wanted to do is not wait for that to happen, that there are things schools can do right now using existing programs and existing assessments. And we've put together a framework that includes assessments that are available for schools to use right now once they've identified students via the standardised systemic assessments like NAPLAN, and ideally by an assessment in Year 1, because Year 3 is a little bit late to start addressing those things. It's not too late, just it's never too late, but it's certainly easier if you start earlier. And those assessments are screening assessments that are relatively easy to implement. They're very cost effective. They've got norms which tell teachers relatively quickly which students are falling below the level that you'd expect for their age and stage of schooling. And then based on those assessment results, what sort of interventions would be the most appropriate? And generally, they fall into two broad categories. They are a decoding or a phonics-based assessment if students are struggling to actually read the words themselves accurately and fluently, or a language intervention, which means that they have weaknesses in vocabulary and other sorts of oral language.
Thanks, Jen. And our report in June recommended expanding successful literacy and numeracy programs after lockdown. You've been a big advocate for structured literacy programs. Can you describe what this structure involves and why it has benefits?
Yes, certainly. And all of the interventions that we have listed in that primary reading pledge document fall into that category. So a structured intervention will be one that's very well planned. There's a sequence of instruction that lessons fall into, or are rather planned in a very deliberate sequence to build on foundational skills through to more complex skills, that there is built-in monitoring, reteaching if necessary. So it's really about being methodical and making sure that also that the assessment is the right one to intervene with the sub-skill of reading that the child is having difficulty with. So there's not much point giving a reading comprehension intervention for a child who's struggling just to read the words. So obviously that, they need to work on reading comprehension as well, but that very foundational skill is the one that they will need to catch up on if they're going to benefit from other types of instruction as well.
Thanks so much. We're going to turn now to Robbie, who's joining us very graciously from the UK in the early hours of the morning there. In June this year, the UK government announced big investments of £1 billion to help disadvantaged students catch up because of COVID lockdowns, of which £350 million has been allocated for tutoring. I'd love for you to tell us how the new national tutoring scheme in the UK will work.
Thanks, Kat, and great to be here. It's not too early. I've got my coffee. The National Tutoring Programme has really got off the ground pretty quickly. So a group of charities in the UK, with some support from the Department for Education, have launched this programme, and it's a very, very simple idea. We want to significantly increase the availability of high quality, low cost tutoring to schools, and in particular to disadvantaged children across England. So the idea here is we want to provide additional resource and support into schools, recognising that the school year, which has just begun in England, is going to be a really, really difficult one for schools and children. The programme's got two components. The first is about recognising that there's actually quite a big tutoring sector already in England. So as a country, we spend about $2 billion a year on tutoring, but currently that tutoring widens the attainment gap between rich and poor rather than narrowing it. So what we want to do is harness that tutoring and make it available directly to schools in a low cost way. So it's going to be heavily subsidized by that government funding that you mentioned. In essence, schools will be provided with an approved list of tutoring providers, and they'll be able to access that high quality, low cost tutoring from the voluntary sector, from universities, or from existing tutoring providers in the sector. The second element of the National Tutoring Programme is even more direct, and that's about supporting schools to directly employ an academic mentor, would be the phrase that we would use, that would be directly employed by that school, and would in essence provide more intensive one-to-one or small group tutoring throughout the year to students in that school. And in that case, schools would be hiring either graduates who would be trained, or in some cases we have an unusual situation in England, which I don't know whether it's been replicated in Australia, whereby there's a cohort of teachers who have completed initial teacher training, but who haven't yet been placed in schools as a result of some of the labour market disruptions and fewer teachers leaving the profession in a really turbulent last academic year. So we've got some of those trained teachers who haven't yet been directly employed, and they'll be working as this additional tutoring workforce.
Yes, and that's something we certainly talk about in the Grattan report that was released in June, who would be doing this tutoring. But the thing is too that tutoring markets can be a bit of a wild west for schools because there's not a lot of quality assurance. How is this issue being managed in the UK in the implementation of the new scheme?
You're absolutely right, Kat. I think that's the real problem. So we know that tutoring can work, and there's a really substantial evidence base looking at primary schools and secondary schools, subjects in maths and English, that really demonstrates that tutoring can work. And as I said, we know that many families who can afford it are accessing and are using tutoring. But from the school's perspective, that phrase "Wild West" is the right one. We don't know if you're a head teacher, which of these providers that is all saying similar sounding things is going to be high quality, and this isn't really the time when you want to be taking a gamble. So that's where the sort of coordination of the National Tutoring Programme comes in. And the Education Endowment Foundation, which is the charity I work for, is in a way playing an intermediary role. So taking a process where tutoring providers apply, explain the evidence that they've collected so far about their model, and are also assessed against a number of criteria. So obviously criteria related to safeguarding, but also questions about the model that they have. So one of the key things we know from the existing evidence base about tutoring is that tutoring really needs to be a tool for teachers. In a sense, you need the teachers to do that assessment that Julie mentioned, identify where the gaps might be, and then ask the tutor to provide that additional capacity and additional focus that they themselves might not be able to do with the 101 other things that they need to be doing, and their focus on that tier one teaching that Jennifer mentioned.
And certainly having those checks and balances in place provides a lot more quality control than just going out to market. In contrast to Jen's earlier comments about structured literacy programs, the UK National Tutoring Scheme supports more flexible tutoring approaches that don't always have sets of prescribed materials or pedagogies. Why is that?
Sure. So, I mean, I guess I wouldn't see a tension here. I absolutely think that for students with a sort of a diagnosed literacy need and who are clearly struggling, for example, to read at that transition from primary to secondary, then you absolutely will benefit from a targeted approach and that structure that Jennifer mentioned. So I really wouldn't sort of set these up in competition. I think what we recognised is that going into this next academic year in England, we've got 1.8 million disadvantaged students. So on average, we think that they will have fallen behind significantly compared to their peers. And we want schools to have access to that additional resource. So it might be in maths, it might be in English, it might be students making that transition and learning to read, or it might be students preparing for exams at the end of the year. So I think this is a time where we really felt we needed to have the best bet on the basis of the evidence, but also something that we could scale up as quickly as possible, given these exceptional circumstances.
Yes, and these strange times call for measures that sometimes extraordinary. And I think of all the teachers that have really gone out of their way to educate students this year and gone above and beyond. You can tell that I'm the daughter of two teachers. The next section, we're actually going to talk a little bit about the implementation issues facing some of these suggested programs. So I'm going to go around the panelists with some specific questions, but I'd encourage you to keep adding your questions in the Q&A. I've got a few there already. And the first question is for you, Jen, and it's just to touch on the programs that you did mention before, especially in terms of identifying students who've fallen behind and seeing where they need help. And for these catch-up programs to work, I think the teachers need good skills in these assessments. How do we build these skills for teachers, and are the teacher capabilities sufficiently well developed in Australia, or do we need to give them extra support?
I think it's some teachers do know very well how to do this, and others it's not something that they have had much training in. But having said that, there are new assessments being made available fairly regularly. So it's really useful to have a good sense of not just training on how to implement particular assessments, but the principles that underpin good assessment, why you do it, what sort of things you're looking for. But having said that, screening assessments, the sorts that we've recommended in the Primary Reading Pledge, are relatively straightforward to deliver. The administration instructions are not difficult to follow. The main difficulty is making sure that time is found within teaching time to do that. Assessment is a really important part of the teaching and learning process, but that ongoing assessment sometimes gets pushed down the priority list, and it's really important to do that. We do have our standardised assessments, but these other sorts of assessments that drill down more into sub-skills are really important. The sorts of very complicated diagnostic assessments are ones that we don't recommend that teachers do, that those are done by education psychologists, speech pathologists. They're the sorts of diagnostic assessments that are actually looking for reading difficulties or reading disabilities. And so that's not something that teachers need to concern themselves with implementing themselves, but of course they need the sorts of other assessments that point in the direction of a student needing that kind of support. So yes, I think, as a general point, it's very helpful for teachers to have some professional development and training in that area in terms of the assessments themselves. So it's really a matter of knowing which ones to use and when to use them. And that's the main thing rather than the administration per se.
Thanks, Jen. Turning to you, Robbie, teaching assistants, they're likely to be part of any large-scale COVID catch-up response in schools, but they can be perceived as a threat to teachers' professionalism. What factors matter for teaching assistants to work well as tutors, and when should we not use them?
Thanks very much, Kat. The teaching assistants example is really interesting. I think it is very helpful to think about when scaling up a program like the National Tutoring Program. As I say, I think one of the key ideas here is that teachers need to work as a team with teaching assistants and with tutors, and in essence to lead that team. So we think that tutoring is likely to be most effective, and teaching assistants are likely to be able to make the biggest possible contribution to learning if they work really, really effectively with teachers. And that means that teachers might need training in terms of how to lead that team. It also means that there's a role for school leaders in making sure that there's, for example, time set aside at the start of the week and at times throughout for teachers, teaching assistants and tutors to communicate effectively with each other. I think when we talk about the National Tutoring Programme, it's very, very important that we emphasise the role of the teacher in that. And I think, I worked as an English teacher in East London prior to taking up my current role. And I think you start with this phrase that perhaps a student putting up their hand and saying, my parents got me a tutor isn't always a good idea and isn't always something that sort of fills you with a sense of confidence. And the reason for that is, there's often a clash between the types of advice that a tutor might give and what you as a teacher might say that's not going to be helpful to the pupil. So what we're really, really putting a huge amount of emphasis on is that additional support and additional tutoring needs to have the teacher at the start and at the heart of it. And these are resources for that teacher who needs to do that assessment and then say, actually, what this student would benefit from is some small group sessions focused on this topic or that type of question. And that's how we think we're going to maximize the impact. And that's what the highest quality studies showing the biggest impacts in the past have done.
Jen, I'm wondering if you had anything you wanted to add to that question about TAs? Sorry, you're on mute.
I promised myself I wouldn't forget to do that, and then I did. No, teaching assistants can be fantastic if they are as Robbie said, working with the classroom teacher, and there's no sort of clash in approaches there. And that is one of the things that, I should have mentioned earlier, is it's just really important to have a whole school approach and a planned approach to intervention. And what we're talking about here is not just about COVID catch-up, although that's made this particularly acute. It's something that needs to really happen every year on an ongoing basis, which was with the reason that that we put together that document, is that whole school approach to assessment, intervention, and following up all the time, and making sure there's that consistency between what's going on in the classroom and what's going on in tutoring sessions, whether that's with a teaching assistant or with a learning support teacher, and with the most very well designed and tested sort of scripted programs, you can have a really well trained someone who's not even a teaching assistant necessarily. So that it's really about the training and all of the design work that's gone into that. Ideally, though, you would have school staff working together to make sure that it works as seamlessly as possible, and that no child falls through the cracks, that they're all being followed up right the way through to the end of school.
I'm going to get now into some of the great questions that you've all sent through in the Q&A and both in registering for this panel. I might start actually with this first question. I think this is a great question from Ashley, and she says that I work in a state education department. How do you see departments can really support and empower schools to plan and drive their recovery? I might direct that first to you, Julie, and then ask for your feedback, Jen.
So I think in terms of empowering schools, I think there's a couple of really important aspects to it. One is giving the ultimate decision about how the money is spent to schools, so that they can match the intervention that best meets their students' needs. But second to that, and I think this doesn't happen enough in Victoria, there does need, I think, a really important part of empowering schools is actually doing some of the quality assurance work for schools, so that schools aren't left to try and decide in this kind of Wild West market who they might go for. And so a really important part of that is actually doing the groundwork on which providers seem to be more aligned to the curriculum and have a history of getting good results where that's available. And so that's, I think for me, that's one of the most important ways that government can support schools at the moment.
Jen, did you have anything to add to that?
I think what Julie said's a great idea. Is there are so many options out there in terms of programs, particularly that it's really useful if schools don't have to look at all of them and do all that due diligence themselves, that there's a short list created based on some transparent principles. And that is what happened in England with bringing in systematic synthetic phonics instruction, that there was a list of endorsed programs by the department that schools could choose from, but there are also a set of transparent criteria that the department had used to select those programs, and therefore, schools did find something that was not on that list, but that they deemed to meet those principles, and there was some room for them to then go with that instead. So there's a little bit of flexibility there, but some clear and strong guidelines about what is an effective program and the reasons that it's considered to be effective.
Thanks, Jen. The next question I'll direct at you, Robbie, because I'm interested to see how the UK is managing this issue. And this question came up in quite a few times in different variations. Liz asks that in some schools, the majority of students are vulnerable. What whole school strategies can help students catch up?
Great, thanks very much, Kat. So I think that term vulnerable, obviously, we'll cover many different needs. I think one of the particular challenges that we have related to COVID is about our vulnerabilities related to health and also related to attending school. So something that we're really keen to build in as part of the national tutoring program is flexibility. So nationally, we might have, for example, 50 approved providers who have passed those minimum quality and safeguarding criteria that I mentioned. And we'll be endeavoring to make sure that a significant number of those are online providers or are face-to-face providers who have the ability to flip back to online. So what we are trying to do, and we recognize that these are incredibly uncertain times, but is build in some flexibility that's going to support schools. So if, for example, we have local lockdowns or certain students who are shielding and staying home, then we have different ways of reaching them and supporting them. And I think tutoring that can be both face-to-face or online is one of the tools that we think it's going to be sort of beneficial to have available through this next academic year. I guess one other point I would just add to that phrase, vulnerability, is that tutoring isn't obviously everything, and academic support isn't everything. And I really welcomed and like the section of Julie's report that stress, for example, social and emotional needs, in addition to some of the academic support that's necessary. So I think through advocacy of something like tutoring, I think that is not an attempt to say that everything else can be sort of pushed out or forgotten, but rather it's an acknowledgement that for that specific need, some additional capacity in the system is likely to be beneficial, and in a way that can enable other members of staff and teachers to get to some of the other things on their very long list.
Just a follow-up question for you there, Robbie, because we've had a good question from Babis about the role of technology in education and addressing these kind of equity issues. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that from your perspective.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Kat. I mean, as I mentioned, I think online tutoring now is something that we need to use, we need to explore, and we need to evaluate as we go. And that evaluation, I think, is very, very important. Something that we've noticed in England, and obviously that isn't a surprise, is there is a digital divide. So while students were at home under lockdown, we knew that the access to technology was going to be a barrier for reaching some disadvantaged pupils in particular at home. The model that we'll be primarily testing through the National Tutoring Programme is online tutoring, but where students are still in the school. So, for example, you'll have groups of students in computer labs, and we don't think that there is a digital divide at the school level across England. So that's sort of one of the ways in which we think technology could play a role. I think there's also a question about using technology for assessment, but our emphasis there is that assessment and that identification of needs should be led by the school, using the systems that they feel are most effective at the moment.
Thanks, Robbie. Just wondering if Jen had anything to add to that in terms of technology.
Only that that being able to move between face-to-face and online delivery is much easier with a structured program, and that's one of the benefits also of having a planned and structured program with a sequence of lessons and the content that is to be covered over a period of time, and also the content to be covered in each lesson. That means that teachers don't need to worry about trying to develop lessons that fit a different mode. It's just the mode of delivery changes. And so the schools that I visited in New South Wales since we came out of lockdown here have all said that was made things much easier for them, is to having that structured approach. And so they knew what was next. Students knew what was next, and they could keep proceeding through the content and the skills they needed to learn in a much more sort of systematic and methodical way. And in some of those schools are quite confident that they have lost very little time in terms of learning, because they're actually able to see the progress that children have made as they've worked through that structured program.
Thanks, Jen. Julie, just turning to you, there's an interesting question in the Q&A about how does this catch-up affect students who might be in their final year of school and going into final year assessments? It might be hard for them to get tutoring if they're finishing up with school.
Yes, it's a great question. So I think obviously for those who are doing year 12, you'd be looking at tutoring in term 4 of this year. And yeah, that's a pretty tight turnaround. I think there's a really good question for university next year. So there will be a whole cohort of students who won't necessarily be going into their courses as well prepared as in other years. And universities will need to think about how they're going to address that, whether that be through extra courses over the summer break before students start or in their first semester break. I think at least the relatively good thing is that there'll be a lot of students in the same boat. So universities will need to have that front and centre.
Thanks, Julie. And another question here from Louise, which I think is a very worthwhile question, and it's been mentioned a few times in the questions, this idea of wellbeing. Louise is asking, has Grattan undertaken any research to assess quality evidence-based wellbeing programs that strengthen resilience, wellbeing and mental health? In terms of sequencing, is it best to do intensive work with learners focused on personal development to strengthen their self-esteem and confidence, and then focus on literacy and numeracy?
Great question. Short answer is Grattan hasn't done a piece of work around that, but we are very interested in doing that in the future. You would have seen presumably the existing summaries that have been done by the EEF around what are the types of social and emotional interventions that can be done that boost learning, which is a slightly different focus. And when you take that focus, it's things like the evidence is strongest around explicit teaching of social and emotional skills in the classroom. So teachers, teaching those skills and really using metacognitive strategies and potentially using role plays, stories, and just doing it in everyday routines. So it's not sort of something that's different or separate. It's just, this is how we work. And the second half of that question, Kat, just remind me. It was around...
Using it up again?
Yeah, no, that's fine. I think it was around...
Yes, so it's in terms of sequencing, so basically it's asking...
yes, which should occur first? That's right. Yes, great. I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think obviously it depends on what the child's emotional or social issue might be. I think it's obviously quite complex. I think there is something about establishing routine for learning and being ready to learn. And so from that perspective, kids do need to be, we do know that learning is a social and emotional process, so you need to be open for that. So there is a degree of work that needs to be done before kids will be able to learn. Having said that, confidence does also come from students seeing positive results. So in their learning. So it is obviously interwoven, and I wouldn't be saying that we need to be putting academic learning on hold fully until the social emotional skills are in place, because they're very important.
And having worked as an ESL teacher myself, it is exciting to see a student finally get something that they really struggled with, both for the teachers and the students. Jen, Robbie, I'm just wondering if you had anything to add in terms of that wellbeing question.
I'd agree with, sorry, Robbie, we both jumped in at the same time. No, I'd agree with Julie that, sometimes children, if they are, there is some sort of acute issue in terms of their well-being, then, being able to focus and pay attention to learning will be a struggle. And actually can end up being something that creates a feedback loop, which means they then therefore don't enjoy learning anymore. So it really comes down to, I think, professional judgment and individual children as to which need to address first. But again, as Julie said, not to think, okay, well, we can only focus on one thing at a time, that they progress together, and that success in learning it builds confidence and builds enjoyment in education as well. So they're not mutually exclusive.
Just to add from my perspective, I think in England, there's a real recognition that lockdown has looked very different for the very different groups of children, and we've spoken about disadvantaged students compared to their peers, but obviously those categories are hugely varied. So I think this is one where we think the professional judgment of the school is needed, and I think we've been quite worried about a sort of base presumption that we can't get back to learning until everything else is in place. I think that's going to be right for some students, but it's not going to be right for large groups. So you need to give schools the flexibility, but also recognises, as Julie said, that you can do an awful lot of work to make sure that there's the capacity and the resource that they are going to need to draw as professionals on. And in a way, that's what we've been trying to do in England.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone, for that. Jen, I'm just going to go back to one of the questions from Melanie, which is specific to people from refugee and migrant backgrounds. What additional supports and methods of engagement work best for students and families from these backgrounds?
Well, again, they are not a homogeneous group either. They come with a whole lot of different experiences and also different educational experiences. It's not always true necessarily that children from refugee backgrounds have had no education until they arrive in Australia. Some have, some haven't. And also children from non-English speaking backgrounds come from a variety of different of language backgrounds, and some are highly literate in their own language and some are not. So it's the approach you take with those different groups of students is going to be slightly different. Having said that, however, they still need to get to the same point, so that I guess it's a situation as usual of working out what they know and where are the skill and the knowledge gaps that might need to be filled, and keeping in mind that there is a lot of time to be made up, so there's no time to waste either, and so being very targeted in the skill that's necessary. So those two elements, if you're talking about reading, is that word recognition, so actually learning to work out what the English alphabetic code means and how it works, but then there's the whole vocabulary aspect as well, and if their own language skills, or then their home language skills are very well developed, then you can build upon those. If they're not, then there's an added layer to that as well.
Thanks, Jen. Someone's asked specifically for your tips on just what assessments and interventions would you specifically recommend? So I might ask you first, and then I'll ask the rest of the panellists as well.
Sure, I'll show you this document. So this is available from 5from5.org.au, and the appendices have a list of interventions and assessments. So I won't go through and name them all. They're all listed there and they're very easy to find. But essentially they're broken down in terms of interventions into screening assessments and in diagnostic assessment. So the first thing you do is a screening assessment and offer a small group intervention. And the next thing you would do if a child doesn't respond to that intervention is perhaps refer them for a diagnostic assessment and a tier 3, which is a much more specialist assessment. So in terms of the interventions, they fall into two broad categories as well. There's evidence-informed and evidence-based. And those two terms tend to be used interchangeably. In our document, we define them as evidence-informed as they've been developed on evidence-based principles. They have a sound evidence base in terms of the sorts of skills and knowledge that they are working on, and in terms of pedagogy. So generally, they will be very explicit and systematic programs. Evidence-based are programs that have been shown to be effective with students with reading difficulties, either moderate or severe. And the list of programs that we have is relatively long because we've relied both on research evidence, so published studies, but also professional experience of the three organisations involved in putting this document together. So there are programs out there that haven't had an enormous amount of rigorous evaluation, but in terms of the design of the program and its content, there's good reason to believe that it works, and also in the experience of the professionals who are working with them, they've seen it work very well. But we have identified the difference between the two in this list, so schools can then, make a decision on that basis as to how they're going to prioritise that evidence-based versus evidence-informed. Evidence-based programs tend to be a little bit more expensive because they've had a lot of research and development gone into creating them. And again, that's part of the reason why, as was identified in the guidance that was put together by EEF on key stage 1 programs or teaching, that Not all programs have been really rigorously evaluated. It's a fairly expensive thing to do. You've got to find someone who will do it, particularly an independent evaluation. So the process is long-term and requires resources. So the list of schools that meet that programs that meet that tight criteria is smaller than the list of programs that sort of meet the broader set of criteria of what an effective intervention should look like.
Thanks, Jen. Just before we jump to Robbie, could you just let us know where our viewers and listeners can access that again?
Yes, it's www.5from5.com.au. So 5 from 5 spelled out with letters.
Thanks, Jen. And Robbie, are there any resources or assessments or things that you could recommend that that teachers or educators could use?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Kat. I mean, so on the Education Endowment Foundation website, and also on the National Tutoring Programme website, we've put quite a lot of resources on there, in particular about this question about assessment before intervention or before support. So the National Tutoring Programme is sort of deliberately designed to kick in the second half of the first term in the school year. So giving schools essentially 6 to 8 weeks to conduct those assessments and work out where the gaps are and where tutoring would be best placed to support. So on the National Tutoring Programme website, there's a set of resources that can help schools with that.
Now, Julie, I'm not sure if we have Grattan resources for teachers, but given we're getting close to time, I'm just wondering if there were any particular reports or research that you wanted to quickly mention to our viewers.
Not specifically, no. I think most of our recommendations are at a system level. So I just reiterate, I think this is a huge gap in the market, and I think government should be providing some really strong advice to schools on this specific issue at this point in time.
So we're coming close to time. I'm just having a look at some of our last little questions that we have. There's a really interesting one from Rachel, which is, how can we honour those students who may have struggled in a school setting but thrive in lockdown? How do we strike a balance? I might direct that one to you, Jen.
Yeah, gee, that's a tough one, because there are a small number of students who really have enjoyed being able to study from home, and it's really not easy to answer that question because it's not something that students have a choice about generally. That they need to be in school. There are benefits to being in school that extend beyond the academic learning in a kind of narrow sense necessarily, and it's I think recognising that is important, and working out which those students are, and perhaps finding ways that they can do more work independently if they've enjoyed working independently. Is there some scope within the day for them to do that kind of work? And that's all I could recommend at this point. This past year has sort of opened up lots of things that we didn't know about before in the way that students like to work, and in the enormous capacity of teachers to adapt quickly and effectively. And it's been quite incredible to watch, actually. So a lot to be learned from the last few months, both from a student and a teacher perspective.
Well, we're getting really close to time there, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all the excellent questions on our Q&A and that were requested, but I really encourage you, if you've got more questions, to talk to our wonderful panellists on social media or to get in touch. Please continue the conversation online. Before we close up, I'd like to just go around to our panellists and ask them, what's their key thing they'd like you to take away from this webinar today, if you could keep it to a minute, and where perhaps they could find you and your research. We'll start with you, Robbie.
Thanks so much, Kat. I mean, I've really enjoyed the conversation today. I think one of the things I would mention in a way is that it's always been the case that we should be looking to evidence, and we should be evaluating as we go and trying to find some of the sort of strongest bets in trying to improve outcomes for disadvantaged learners. But what has happened as a result of the pandemic is, in a way, it's created some disruption and an opportunity to do things that perhaps we wouldn't really have got around to doing, or wouldn't have been thinking about in terms of the same level of ambition. So I think through the national tutoring program in England, we would say would always have been a good idea, but in a way, this is the time now to be focused and to get something off the ground that will have an impact as a COVID catch-up support, but also as a long-term driver of narrowing the gap. And so in a way, I would encourage schools, but also policymakers to sort of think big. I think this is the time to be bold and to use evidence as we act, but also to recognise that opportunities to do things that have real long-term impacts that don't come around all the time, and so try and take advantage of that.
Thanks, Robbie. How about you, Jen?
Really, just to repeat what I said before in terms of just taking that methodical whole school approach. So rather than thinking about this entirely as just a short-term effort, and yes, there is a need to respond to a particular need at the moment, but just even if it does take a little bit longer, to think about how do we put in place something now that is going to be able to be used year on year. We may have more students in need of using this plan right now, but no matter what we do, there's always going to be a certain number of students who are going to need extra support and shouldn't be allowed to get to the end of year 6 and move into year 7 with those very minimal reading skills. So, and also, as Robbie said, it's an opportunity to appraise that and take stock and put some plans in place now that will prevent that happening into the future if we can.
Julie?
I would second, I think, a lot of what Robbie and Jennifer just said. In short, I think policymakers now have an opportunity that they haven't had before to really look at inequality in the system and what can be done to really help some students catch up in their learning. So use the goodwill that's in the community right now before we forget all of the valuable lessons we've actually learned out of lockdown in terms of compassion for our fellow human beings and fellow students who are in the same class as our own children.
Thank you so much to Jennifer, Julie and Robbie for their wonderful insights today. I've really enjoyed this conversation and I hope you have too. And also I'd love to thank all of the people who've tuned in today. We really appreciate you coming to watch this afternoon, and also for all your hard work in lockdown. We know how difficult it's been, especially for all the educators and education workers out there, speech pathologists, and all the people who are working really hard to make students, give students a better chance at an education and improve their education. So we thank you as well. Before you go, I'd love to say that Grattan is a non-profit organisation and we do put all of our research and our webinars out there for free. If you have enjoyed today's today's webinar, I would really appreciate it if you went to grattan.edu.au/donate and consider donating to us. We'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much for coming today. Like I said, please continue to engage with us online, and thanks so much for coming today.